Helicopter is flying low over a Hawaiian rainforest at 4 inches the morning. It's dark, it's wet, and inside the cargo hold, there are containers holding over 1 billion mosquitoes, not to kill them, not to study them, not to trap them, to release them, on purpose. Tens of millions of mosquitoes, dropped from the sky into one of the most ecologically sensitive places on Earth. And the scientists doing it weren't reckless. They weren't desperate. They were some of the most careful, decorated conservation biologists on the planet. And they had been planning this moment for years. The thing is, this wasn't a horror movie. It wasn't a government experiment gone wrong. It was the last realistic option left on the table to save birds that have been disappearing from Hawaii for over 100 years. Birds that sing in colors, if that makes sense. Birds that look like someone dipped a paintbrush in gold and red and black and then forgot to stop. Birds that exist nowhere else on Earth, and that by the time this plan was launched, were down to populations in the hundreds. Not thousands. Hundreds. The Hawaiian honeycreeper, the apapane, the iiwi, the Maui akepa. Names that sound like they belong in a myth. And birds that, if things had stayed on their current course, would have become one. So what happened when those mosquitoes were released? Did it work? Did it backfire? And what does any of this have to do with you? With the idea of building a life that costs less and demands less and still gives you more? We're going to get into all of that. But first, let me tell you where this story actually starts, because it doesn't start in Hawaii, and it doesn't start with birds. It starts with a ship. Before we go any further, if this is the kind of content you want more of, real stories with real stakes, hit subscribe. New videos every week. And this channel is built for people who want to understand things deeply, not just scroll past them. Now, back to that ship. Somewhere around 1826, a ship called the Wellington dropped anchor off the coast of Maui. We don't know exactly which ship it was. The historical record is fuzzy on the details. But what we do know is that when one of those ships watered up near Lahaina, it brought something ashore in the water barrels. Something small. Something that buzzed. Culex quinquefasciatus. The southern house mosquito. Hawaii had no mosquitoes before that. None. The islands had been isolated in the middle of the Pacific for millions of years. And in that isolation, life had evolved in extraordinary ways. Without predators, without diseases, without the blood-sucking insects that the rest of the world had learned to deal with over millions of years of coexistence. The birds of Hawaii never had to develop immunity to mosquito-borne illness because there had never been mosquito-borne illness to develop immunity to. And then there was avian malaria and avian pox, both carried by Culex quinquefasciatus, moved through Hawaiian bird populations with the efficiency of a wildfire in a drought. Birds that had spent tens of millions of years evolving in paradise had no defenses, no immune memory, no biological answer. They just died. The Hawaiian birds that lived at lower elevations went first. They were closest to the standing water where mosquitoes breed, closest to where ships came in, closest to where people settled and cleared land, and created exactly the warm, wet, stagnant conditions that mosquitoes love. Species disappeared so fast that in many cases, scientists didn't even get to document them properly before they were gone. We know they existed from bones, from the accounts of early naturalists, from feathers preserved in museum collections on the other side of the world. But living populations? Gone. The birds that survived were the ones that had retreated upward. High enough on the slopes of Maui, Kauai, and the Big Island, the temperature drops cold enough that mosquitoes can't complete their life cycle. So, for most of the 20th century, the surviving Hawaiian birds essentially lived on the upper floors of the islands, tucked into high-elevation forests above a line that ecologists grimly started calling the mosquito line. Above that line, the birds sang and nested and fed and raised their young. Below that line, it was basically a death zone. The problem, and this is where the story starts to get really uncomfortable, is that the mosquito line has been moving. Climate change has been warming the upper slopes. The temperature has been rising, and with it, the mosquitoes have been creeping higher. Year after year, the safe zone has been shrinking. The birds have been getting pushed into smaller and smaller patches of cold forest. and there's only so much mountain left. By the time researchers at the San Diego Zoo Wildlife Alliance, the University of Hawaii, and the American Bird Conservancy started seriously discussing what would become the mosquito management program, the numbers were staggering in the worst possible way. The iiwi, one of the most iconic Hawaiian honeycreepers, bright scarlet with a long curved bill designed perfectly for the native lobelias and Hawaiian flowers it feeds on, had lost 90% of its population range since the 1970s alone. Not since European contact. Since 1970, the kiwikwiu, also called the Maui parrotbill, had somewhere between 150 and 500 individuals left on the entire planet. The Maui alawahio was hanging on in the high bogs of Haleakala. The akohekohe, a bird with a crest of white feathers that makes it look like it's wearing a tiny crown, was down to a single population on the windward slopes of Haleakala. There were captive breeding programs, there were habitat restoration efforts, there were predator control programs removing rats and mongoose and feral cats from certain areas. All of it helped. None of it was enough, because none of it addressed the actual mechanism of death, the mosquito. So, the question became, can you change the mosquito? Not eliminate it. Not poison it with pesticides that would also kill everything else. Change it. From the inside. Here is where the science gets genuinely fascinating, and I want to take a minute here because understanding this part is what makes the rest of the story click into place. Inside the cells of many insects, there lives a naturally occurring bacteria called Wolbachia. It's not a disease, not a parasite in the traditional sense, more like a passenger, and many Culex mosquitoes in the wild already carry certain strains of it. Here's the thing about Wolbachia that makes it so interesting. When a mosquito carrying one strain of Wolbachia mates with a mosquito carrying a different strain, or no strain at all, something happens to the eggs. They don't develop, the fertilization fails, the offspring don't survive. Scientists call this cytoplasmic incompatibility. What it means in practice is this. If you take male mosquitoes, only males that don't bite because only females bite, and you infect them with a strain of Wolbachia that's different from the strain the wild female mosquitoes in Hawaii carry. And then you release those males into the wild, they mate with the wild females, and the eggs fail. No new mosquitoes. The population crashes. It's not a pesticide. It's not a genetic modification that could spread through the ecosystem in unpredictable ways. It's a naturally occurring biological mechanism being strategically deployed. The males die without reproducing. The females they mated with produce no surviving offspring. And because only males were released, nothing is biting anyone. The technical term for this approach is incompatible insect technique, or IIT. It had been tested before. In California, targeting Aedes mosquitoes in Fresno County, it had reduced populations by up to 96% in treated areas. But Hawaii was different. Hawaii was a rainforest. Hawaii was remote terrain, uneven, wet, dense, with no roads into many of the most critical areas. And the stakes were not a nuisance mosquito problem in a suburban county. The stakes were the last surviving members of species that will never exist again if this doesn't work. The Birds, Not Mosquitoes Coalition, bringing together the San Diego Zoo Wildlife Alliance, the American Bird Conservancy, Maui Forest Bird Recovery Project, and several state and federal agencies, spent years getting this right before a single mosquito was released. First, they had to figure out how to raise the mosquitoes, more than 1 billion across the course of the program. You can't just catch wild males and release them. You have to breed them in controlled conditions, infect them with the right Wolbachia strain, confirm that only males are being released, and do all of this at a scale that makes the field releases meaningful. The rearing facility they built on Maui could produce roughly 150,000 males per week at the start, eventually scaling up significantly. The mosquitoes were sorted, males separated from females with remarkable precision. And then came the delivery problem. How do you release mosquitoes in a Hawaiian rainforest at 6,000 feet elevation in terrain so steep and dense that you can't get vehicles in? Helicopters. The team developed a specialized release system mounted to helicopters, flying predetermined grid patterns over the treatment areas in the Hakalau Forest National Wildlife Refuge and the high-elevation forests of Haleakala, releasing clouds of male mosquitoes into the mist. They started the first field releases in 2023. The early results were being analyzed even as the program continued to expand. And this is where the story gets into genuinely uncharted territory, because what happened next wasn't just a conservation success or failure, it was a window into something larger. I want to stop here for a moment and talk about what's actually at stake in a way that goes beyond the numbers. Because extinction statistics are easy to become numb to. 150 individuals remaining. Population down 90%. Range reduced by 2/3. These numbers are real, but they're abstractions. They're the kind of thing you read in a report and nod at and then close your laptop. Let me try to make it less abstract. The iiwi song is one of those sounds that people who've heard it in the wild describe with an almost embarrassing amount of emotion. It's not a melodic song the way you might imagine a tropical bird singing. It's stranger than that, and more interesting, squeaky, almost mechanical, mixed with liquid notes that sound like water moving over stones. Early Hawaiians incorporated the iiwi into their oral traditions. Its feathers were woven into the royal capes and helmets of the alii, the Hawaiian nobility. The iiwi was not just a bird, it was woven into the fabric of an entire civilization. The apapane, which feeds almost exclusively on the nectar of the ohia lehua tree, actually plays a direct role in the pollination of one of Hawaii's most culturally and ecologically significant plants. The ohia is the tree that colonizes fresh lava flows first. It's often the first thing that grows on bare volcanic rock. In Hawaiian tradition, the ohia and the lehua flower are considered sacred, tied to stories of Pele, the volcano goddess. The apapane and the ohia are so deeply linked that some researchers describe them as co-evolved partners. Lose one, and you stress the other. These are not just species on a list. They are threads in an ecological and cultural tapestry that took millions of years to weave. And a mosquito that arrived on a ship in 1826 has been unraveling it ever since. Nothing in conservation is clean, and the mosquito management program, for all its scientific elegance, came with real complications that the team had to navigate carefully. The first was community concern. Hawaii has a complicated history with introduced species. The mongoose was brought in during the 1880s to control rats in the sugarcane fields. What happened? The mongoose preferred birds, eggs, ground nesting species. The mongoose became one of the most destructive, invasive predators in Hawaiian history. So when people heard the words, "We're going to release 1 billion mosquitoes," the reaction was not universally positive, even when the science was carefully explained. There were public meetings, community consultations, including with native Hawaiian cultural practitioners, concerns about the use of Wolbachia, even though it is naturally occurring and widespread in insects globally, and questions about unintended consequences. The coalition took these concerns seriously. The consultations were genuine, extended conversations. Some people remained skeptical. Some changed their minds. What the coalition found was that the people with the strongest ties to the land and the birds were often among the most willing to support a serious intervention. Because they had watched the silence spread, they knew what losing the birds really felt like. The second complication was ecological uncertainty. Even with the best science, releasing 1 billion of anything into a complex ecosystem carries risk. What if the Wolbachia strain moved in unexpected ways? What if suppression created a vacuum another mosquito species rushed to fill? What if something the team hadn't modeled happened? These weren't hypothetical concerns dismissed by overconfident scientists. They were exactly the questions the team spent years working through, building monitoring programs to detect unintended effects, setting up comparison plots to track what was happening in treated versus untreated areas. Science, real science, is full of uncertainty. The team wasn't pretending otherwise. The program began releasing mosquitoes in earnest in 2023. Early monitoring data, which started coming in through late 2023 and into 2024, showed something that gave the researchers genuine reason for cautious optimism. In treatment areas, mosquito populations began declining. Not immediately, not overnight, but measurably. The incompatible insect technique was doing what it was supposed to do. The incompatible males were mating with wild females. The eggs were failing. The population was being suppressed. Bird monitoring teams working in the same areas reported something that might sound small, but was enormous in context. More birds. Not dramatically more, not instant recovery, but movement. Apapani, moving into lower elevations in treatment areas where they hadn't been observed in years. Iiwi singing from trees at altitudes that had been quiet for a long time. The forests weren't silent anymore. One researcher described it in an interview as hearing a sound she had only ever heard recordings of, hearing it live, in a place that was supposed to be empty of it, and having to stop and just stand there for a minute. The program wasn't claiming victory. The researchers were being careful about what the early data meant. A single breeding season doesn't tell you about population recovery. The monitoring needed to continue for years, the releases sustained. There was, and is, a long road ahead. But the mechanism was working. The birds were responding. And for the first time in a very long time, the people who had dedicated their lives to this work had something other than mounting dread to report. Hawaii is often called the extinction capital of the world. It's not a title anyone wanted. Of the approximately 142 bird species that existed when the first Polynesian settlers arrived, roughly 95 are now extinct. Today, the United States endangered species list includes more Hawaiian species than any other state, by a wide margin. The Hawaiian honeycreepers evolved from a single ancestor that arrived between 5 and 7 million years ago. From that founding population, evolution produced between 50 and 60 distinct species, each adapted to different niches and food sources. One of the most dramatic examples of adaptive radiation on Earth, and more than half of them are already gone. The mosquito management program isn't just about saving some pretty birds in a tropical paradise. It's about whether we can actually reverse a process of destruction we set in motion in the era of climate change and invasive species spreading on every shipping lane on the planet, or whether extinction, once started, only goes in one direction. This channel is about living well on less. So what does a Hawaiian bird and a billion mosquitoes have to do with that? More than you might think. One of the foundational ideas behind choosing a lower footprint life is the recognition that the systems we've been sold, the ones that tell us growth is always good and more is always better, are not neutral. They have costs. Real costs that get paid by people, places, and species that don't have lobbyists. The mosquitoes arrived because of shipping. The forests were cleared for plantation agriculture. The mongoose was introduced because rats were eating the cane. The climate change now pushing the mosquito line up the mountain is downstream of the same logic. Burn more, produce more, externalize the costs onto the land, the atmosphere, the birds. When you choose to live on less, you are saying the costs matter. That the things not counted in GDP matter. That birds singing in forests most of us will never visit matter. That's not sentiment. That's a coherent value system. The economics are direct. The mosquito management program costs tens of millions over its life. That sounds enormous until you put it next to the alternative. Extinction has its own economics. The ohia drives the fog drip that feeds Hawaiian streams and aquifers. Lose the apapane, lose the ohia, and you are looking at water security problems for a community on an island in the middle of the ocean. Ecosystems are infrastructure, and infrastructure is always cheaper to maintain than to rebuild after collapse. Hawaii's ecological story is a compressed version of something happening more slowly everywhere else. The islands evolved in isolation, species filling niches without the usual predators and competitors, and that optimization was also its vulnerability. Without the redundancy of a mainland ecosystem hammered by glaciers and droughts and predators, the Hawaiian system was beautiful, precise, and fragile. Things that look stable for a very long time can be deeply fragile in ways that aren't visible until the disruption arrives. Species that thrived for millions of years went extinct in decades. The same is true of financial systems. personal finances, local economies. The response isn't panic, it's building resilience, redundancy, the capacity to adapt. The birds that survived avian malaria were the ones that could move, that had range, altitude, flexibility. Flexibility is survival. In ecosystems and in lives, the human beings in this story are worth pausing on, because they're remarkable. Carter Atkinson spent decades at the USGS Hawaii field station studying avian malaria. He started in the 1980s, watched species collapse, documented the disease spreading into the high-elevation refuges, and built the foundational research this program runs on. Decades of watching things get worse while doing the science to try to make them better. There are field biologists doing point counts at dawn, standing in a fixed spot counting every bird, detectable by sight or sound in a 5-minute window, across dozens of points, across years. Native Hawaiian practitioners who pushed back, raised concerns, and ultimately chose to support the effort because they understood what losing the birds would mean. Helicopter pilots flying grid patterns over steep terrain in the dark. People sorting mosquitoes. The people doing this conservation work are not getting rich. They are doing work that matters, in places that matter, with consequences that will outlast them. That's a form of wealth that doesn't show up on any financial statement. There is one more piece of this story most people don't know about, and it matters because it shows how much pressure the Hawaiian ecosystem is absorbing simultaneously. While the birds were being hammered by avian malaria, the ohia trees they depend on for nectar started dying. In 2014, researchers began finding dead ohia on the Big Island, not scattered individual trees. Patches, then larger patches, then stands covering hundreds and then thousands of acres. The cause was two newly identified fungal pathogens, Ceratocystis leucoohia and Ceratocystis huliohia, together called rapid ohia death. By 2023, it had killed or was killing ohia across more than 130,000 acres on the Big Island, with detections on Maui, Kauai, and Oahu. The mosquitoes are killing the birds, the fungus is killing the trees, the climate is warming the refuges. All of this simultaneously. What this double crisis illustrates is that ecological emergencies don't come one at a time, they compound. When you push a system to its limits in the name of efficiency or extraction, you reduce not just its baseline, but its ability to absorb the next shock. Resilience has to be built in advance. You cannot manufacture it after the crisis has started. Hawaii's situation is extreme but not unique in kind. Island ecosystems worldwide face the same dynamics. The Galapagos are fighting invasive rodents, fire ants, and feral cats. New Zealand has been running helicopter-based poison drops across remote islands to protect kiwi and kakapo. The chestnut blight wiped out the American chestnut from 4 billion trees to near extinction in decades. The emerald ash borer has killed hundreds of millions of ash trees across North America. The question this program is really asking is not just whether we can save these birds, it's whether we have the scientific capacity, the institutional will, and the resources to intervene effectively in biological systems we've disrupted. And if we can do it for Hawaiian honeycreepers, what else might we be able to do? Here's what recovery actually looks like in a Hawaiian forest. It doesn't look like anything at first. It sounds like something. The absence of birdsong is one of those things you don't fully register until the song comes back. Researchers and volunteers in the treatment areas during the 2023 to 2024 monitoring season reported something that multiple people described in similar terms, almost like they'd rehearsed it, even though they hadn't. They described walking through forests they'd walked through before, and hearing something different, not louder, just more layers, more movement. A call from a direction where nothing had called before. An iwi in a part of the forest where iwi hadn't been detected in the prior season's counts. One field monitor described it as the forest waking up. That's not science. That's experience. But science and experience are not in opposition here. The point counts were backing it up. The mosquito traps were showing suppressed populations. The eggs in the nests that the monitoring teams were tracking were hatching. Things were alive that might not have been alive. That's not everything. It's a start. A small section of forest in the mountains of Maui, showing early signs of something that has to be sustained over years to become real recovery. There will be setbacks, seasons where the data doesn't cooperate, funding uncertainties, weather events, the ongoing creep of climate change, and ROD. But in a story that has had very few hopeful moments for a very long time, this is a hopeful moment. And hopeful moments in conservation are worth sitting with, even carefully, even with eyes open to everything that still has to go right. There are a few things worth doing, none of them world-altering on their own, all of them real. If you travel to Hawaii, take the biosecurity warning seriously. Don't carry soil between regions. There is a direct line between your support and mosquitoes in the air and birds in the trees. Reduce your consumption footprint. The carbon emissions driving climate change are driving the mosquito line up the mountain. It's a physical mechanism. Every ton of carbon not emitted is, fractionally, a bit more cold mountain for the birds to live in. Pay attention to local ecological stories where you live. Every region has them. Invasive species, habitat loss, species hanging on in fragments of what their range used to be. Knowing your local version of this story is the first step toward caring. And caring is the first step toward action. The Hawaiian forests before the ships arrived had been running on enough for millions of years. A system in equilibrium with itself, cycling nutrients and relationships through an intricate web of interdependence. When that changed, the first things to go were the most specialized, the most precisely fitted to their roles. The generalists survived. The flexible ones, the ones that could eat anything and live anywhere. There's a version of the human world trending in the same direction, toward homogenization, toward the world where every city has the same stores and every neighborhood was built by the same developer, efficient in a narrow sense, fragile in the same way. Choosing to live locally, to support local food systems and local ecological knowledge is how you maintain diversity. In a world of compounding disruptions, the diverse system has options the homogenized one doesn't. The Hawaiian bird crisis is not over, not even close. The mosquito management program is a significant development, but it's one piece of a much larger, longer effort. The birds need the mosquitoes suppressed. They also need the ohia to survive, the habitat protected from feral ungulates, the high-elevation refuges to remain cold enough to function as refuges, and the captive breeding programs for the most critically endangered species to keep those populations viable while the wild habitat recovers. They need decades of sustained effort. The story isn't over because extinction isn't over. But the story has, right now, in the forests of Maui and the monitoring stations where researchers are listening and hoping, a chapter that looks different from the last several. A chapter where the mechanism of death is being interrupted, where the birds are tentatively reclaiming territory they'd lost, where the work of a coalition of scientists, conservationists, community members, helicopter pilots, and people sorting mosquitoes is producing something other than a decline curve. Something that, if everything goes roughly right, might one day be called the beginning of a recovery. The iiwi is still singing up there on the high slopes of Haleakala. The apapane is still moving between the ohia blossoms. The forests are still alive with the descendants of birds that survived 150 years of disaster. And 1 billion mosquitoes are in the air, changing the equation. If you made it this far, you're the kind of person this channel is made for. Someone who wants to understand the actual shape of the world, not just the headline version. Someone who sees the connection between how we live and what we lose, and what we might still be able to keep. Subscribe if you haven't. Share this video with someone who would find it worth thinking about. And if you want to go deeper on the Hawaiian ecosystem, on low-impact living, or on the science of species recovery, click the video on screen now. The birds are still out there. That's something worth holding on to.